is a story that's kind of important to me, and it's going to be hard for me to get through, but I'm going to try. Palestinians are not liars. And this is in ScheerPost. Confronting the violence of media delegitimization, which is what's been happening to the Palestinian people, to their journalism, and to the people who are trying to report the truth of what's happening to them in Gaza and all over. But this is Ramzy Baroud, who I think is terrific. This is in MintPress news. 55 journalists already have been killed and hundreds more injured or detained by Israel since 2000. But yet for many Palestinian, physical harm they face pales in comparison to the constant delegitimization of their work by the media. I mean, we've seen this, but on January 19th, during one of its raids in the occupied West Bank, the Israeli military arrested a Palestinian journalist, Abdul Muhsen Shaladeh, near Al-Khalil, Hebron. This is just the latest of a staggering number of violations against Palestinian journalists and freedom of expression.
Mm-hmm.
I know I'm going to have some friends of mine that I'll probably get some phone calls and arguments about from this, but let me get through this and we'll
I mean,
get to
you
it.
can get them Roger Waters tickets.
Yeah, definitely.
So...
A few days earlier, the head of the Palestinian Journalist Syndicate, or PJS, Nasser Abu Bakr, shared some tragic numbers during a press conference in Ramallah. As she said, 55 reporters have been killed, either by Israeli fire or bombardment. He said since 2000. Hundreds more wounded, arrested, detained. Although shocking, much of this reality is censored in mainstream media. Yes. The murder by Israeli occupation soldiers of veteran Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, of course, on May 11th was an exception, partly due to the global influence of her employer, Al Jazeera. Still, Israel and its allies labored to hide the news, resorting to the usual tactic of smearing those who defy the Israeli narrative. And she was murdered, shot, I believe, in the face by the IDF. She was on a wall. She had a journalist's badge. She was wearing a helmet.
The helmet said press on the front.
Yes, it did. Palestinian journalists pay a heavy price for carrying out their mission of spreading the truth about the Israeli oppression of the Palestinians. Their work is critical, not only to good and balanced media coverage, but to the very cause of justice and freedom in Palestine. I mean, the AP building was destroyed last May. Maybe that was even 2021 at this point. In a recent report on January 17th, PJS detailed some of the harrowing experiences of Palestinian journalists. Dozens of journalists were targeted by the occupation forces and settlers during the last year, which was the highest number of serious attacks against Palestinian journalists. However, the harm inflicted on Palestinian journalists is not only physical and material, of course. They're constantly exposed to a very subtle but equally dangerous threat, which is the constant delegitimization of their work. And that AOC is what actual violence with words is. One of the writers of this piece, Romana Rubeo, attended a close meeting involving over 100 Italian journalists on January 18th, which aimed at advising them on how to report accurately on Palestine. Rubeo did her best to convey some of the facts discussed in this article, which she practices daily as the managing editor of the Palestine Chronicle. However, a veteran Israeli journalist, often touted for her courageous reporting on Palestine, dropped a bombshell when she suggested that Palestinians cannot always be trusted with the little details. She communicated something to this effect: though the truth is on the Palestinian side, they cannot be totally trusted about the little details, while the Israelis are more reliable on the little things, but they lie about the big picture. So, as outrageous, let alone Orientalist, such thinking may appear, it dwarfs in comparison to the state-operated Hasbara machine of the Israeli government. But is it true that Palestinians cannot be trusted with the little details? Well, when Shireen was killed, She was not the only journalist targeted in Jenin. All right, her companion, person next to her, Ali al-Saboudi, was present and was also shot and wounded by an Israeli bullet in the back. Naturally, he was the primary witness to what had occurred that day, and he told journalists from his hospital bed that there was no fighting in that area, that he and Shireen were wearing clearly marked press vests, that Israeli soldiers intentionally targeted them, and that Palestinian fighters were not anywhere close to the range from which they were shot. That was not the official story that was put out. All of this was dismissed by Israel and in turn by Western mainstream media, since supposedly, quote, Palestinians could not be trusted with the details, except that's not true. However, investigations by international human rights groups and eventually a bashful Israeli admission of possible guilt proved that al-Samoudi's account was the most honest detailing of the truth. This episode's been repeated hundreds of times throughout the years, where from the outset, Palestinian views are dismissed as untrue or exaggerated, and the Israeli narrative is embraced as the only possible truth, only for the truth to eventually be revealed, authenticating the Palestinian side just about every time. It says every time, but I would say just about every time. Quite often, facts are revealed too little, too late. And that's done by intent. And sounds a lot like the cops over here, huh? Where they get trained.
Yep.
The tragic murder of 12-year-old Palestinian boy, Mohammed al-Durrah, remains the most shameful episode of Western media bias. The death of the boy who was killed by Israeli occupation troops in 2000 in Gaza while sheltered by his father's side was essentially blamed on Palestinians before the narrative of his murder was rewritten, suggesting that he was killed in the crossfire. That version of the story eventually changed to the reluctant acceptance of the Palestinian reporting on the event. Unfortunately, the story didn't end here, as Zionist Hezbollah continued to push its narrative, smearing those who adopt the Palestinian version as being anti-Israel or even anti-Semitic, which is ridiculous because Palestinians are also Semites. Though Palestinian journalism has proved its effectiveness in recent years, with the Gaza wars being a prime example, thanks to the power of social media and its ability to disseminate information directly to news consumers, challenges remain great. Nearly 4 decades after the publishing of Edward Said's essay, Permission to Narrate, and over 10 years after Rafif Zaida's seminal poem, We Teach Life, Sir, it seems that in some media platforms and political environments, Palestinians still need to acquire permission to narrate, partly because of the anti-Palestinian racism that continues to prevail, but also because, per the judgment of supposedly pro-Palestinian journalists, Palestinians cannot be entrusted with the little details. I mean, I can't. I'm just facepalm. However, there's much hope in this story. There is new, empowered, and courageous generation of Palestinian activists, authors, writers, journalists, bloggers, filmmakers, and artists. It's more than qualified to represent Palestinians and to present a cohesive, non-factional, and universal political discourse on Palestine. And we're talking about people like that. I mean, people who we're around quite often, who are outspoken, like Revolutionary Blackout and the folks over there. Just Abby Martin and Gaza Fights for Freedom. So the new generation searching for truth. Indeed, times have changed, and Palestinians no longer require filters as in those speaking on their behalf, since Palestinians are supposedly inherently incapable of doing so. That's, of course, ridiculous. The authors of this article recently have interviewed 2 representatives of this new generation of Palestinian journalists, 2 strong voices that advocate authentic Palestinian presence in international media, journalists and editors Ahmed Al-Anouk and Faya Salash. Salash is a West Bank-based reporter who discussed media coverage based on Palestinian priorities, counting many examples of important stories that go unreported. As a Palestinian woman, she says, quote, we have a lot of obstacles in our life, and they are all related to the Israeli occupation because it's very dangerous to work as a journalist. All the world saw what happened to Shireen for reporting the truth on Palestine, she said. She understands that being a Palestinian reporting on Palestine is not just professional, but an emotional and personal experience as well. Quote, when I work and I'm on the phone with the families of the Palestinian prisoners or martyrs, sometimes I break into tears, unquote. Of course she does. She's human. So, indeed, stories about abuse and targeting of Palestinian women by Israeli soldiers are hardly a immediate topic. But she says that Israel puts on the democracy mask. They pretend that they care for women's rights. But this is not at all what happens here, she says. They hit Palestinian female journalists because they're physically weaker. They curse them with very inappropriate language. I was personally detained for interrogation, she says, by Israeli forces. This affected her work. They threatened her, saying if she continued to depict them as criminals in her work, they would have stopped her from being a journalist. Yeah, sounds like a lot of freedom of press there.
Yep.
Quote, in Western media, they keep talking about women's rights and gender equality, but we don't have rights at all. We don't live like any other country, she added. And so for his part, Al-Anouk, the head of Palestinian-based organization We Are Not Numbers, explained how MSM never allow Palestinian voices to be present in their coverage. Even pieces written by Palestinians are, quote, heavily edited. So it's also the editor's fault. Sometimes they make big mistakes, and when a Palestinian is killed in Gaza or in the West Bank, the editor should also say who the perpetrator is. But these publications often omit this information. They don't mention Israel as the perpetrator. They have some kind of an agenda that they want to impose. Well, we know what that agenda is. When asked how he would change the coverage of Palestine if he worked as an editor in a mainstream Western publication, he said, quote, I would just tell the truth. And this is what we want as Palestinians. We want the truth. We don't want Western media to be biased toward us and attack Israel. We just want them to tell the truth as it should be. You know, I'll finish this and I'll tell a little story about that. Personal. Prioritizing Palestine. Only Palestinian voices can convey the emotions of highly charged stories about Palestine. Stories that never make it to mainstream media coverage. And when they do, they're often missing context, and they prioritize Israeli views, if not outright lies, and sometimes omit Palestinians altogether. But as with the work of Shireen and Al-Samudi, Al-Anouk, and Shalash, and hundreds more, continues to demonstrate Palestinians are qualified to produce high-quality journalism with integrity and professionalism. They must be the core of their own narrative in all its manifestations. And I hate to even draw a comparison in any way, shape, or form to anything that's going on in this country, to what these people have been suffering and under. But the Amazon Labor Union, for example, has to be the organization that messages and frames what the Amazon Labor Union is and wants in the same way, in exactly the same way that Palestinians must be the core of their narrative and all its manifestations. It's time to break away from the old way of thinking that saw them as incapable of narrating or being a liability on his or her own story, of being secondary characters that can be replaced or substituted by those deemed more credible and truthful. Anything less than this can rightfully be mistaken for, I don't know this phrase, Orientalist thinking of a bygone era. It's kind of antiquated thinking of a bygone era, or worse. The story I was going to tell, and it's this paragraph right here. I would just tell the truth. I want the truth. When I was a kid, my brother definitely got some preferential treatment, and at some point it was actually like admitted. And it took years of like being gaslit by one of my parents who denied that this was going on. And in a therapy session, I was asked, like, what do you want? And I was pretty much, I just want the truth to be out. Like, I want people to understand what's going on, why, and that this is not what it's being framed as. And that it eventually ended up happening. You know, the truth ends up coming out in the end. And yeah, it took years. It took me leaving and moving out and wanting equal treatment and being with a parent that would give me equal treatment to my brother, which was all I ever wanted. I never wanted preferential treatment. I just wanted to be treated equally, but it was due to, you know, my mother's own trauma due to divorce and personal who knows what. And, you know, she saw me as my father and just chose to take that out at that, you know, and so I can kind of understand about, you know, like your story is just not being believed and it's being dismissed and somebody else is trying to speak for you and not really messaging it the way that you know it should be messaged and conveyed. And it's you want to scream at the sky every day. And that's why I wanted to tell this story. It's hard for me, especially of course as a Jew, to hear that my people treat our brothers and sisters this way. I mean, we really are.
Were you referencing Old Man Yells at Sky? Was that what it was?
No, that was no. young man who's seen his family and who's spent his whole life fighting.
Yes.
Is Yells at Sky. It's
not Young Man the song.
You know, and I give shout outs and, you know, courageous credit and kudos to Max Blumenthal, to Aaron Mate, to Lee Camp and Eleanor, and to Katie Halper, Jews who stand up to other Jews and say what's going on here is wrong.